Judd Zulgad, Declan Goff producing, and our guest on this episode from Pro Football Focus, friend of the show, Eric Eager. What's happening, Eric? How's quarantine life? Month 3 of quarantine life.
Yeah, we passed day 100. Things are okay. We might be seeing light at the end of the tunnel, although the last 10 days or so have been kind of rough.
So yes, and I think we've been talking about the NFL and how to this point the NFL has gone forward with every step as if they normally would, and so we'll see if COVID winds up derailing the season. But let's assume the season is on, and let's assume the Vikings are playing a full schedule here. We'd love to do a deep dive with you into the offensive line. We want to get meat and potatoes, Judd Zulgad, on this episode of Purple Daily. And so I'm going to throw kind of a broad question at you, and you can answer from an analytical perspective. How good is the Vikings offensive line, or bad, heading into 2020? And what is the upside of the Vikings offensive line, both when you account for scheme and zone blocking in the running game, and when you account for just individual talent and potential at each position?
It's so funny. I mean, I think their offensive line has the potential to be okay in the way that it was okay in 2017, the way that it was okay a season ago. But it also has the components of not being very good if things are not, in place like they were, for example, 15, 16, and 18, the scheme and, the quarterback's ability to avoid pressure were not very good, and, they struggled. So they were last season, if you look at their wins above replacement along the offensive line, they were 18th. They were in the bottom third of the league in terms of pass protection. They were top half in terms of run blocking. It really does, yield the sort of identity that they want. But with Stefanski going to Cleveland, Kubiak taking over, the real question is where the continuity is, because they lose their right guard, and they might be breaking in a rookie left or right tackle in Azra Cleveland later on. So there's a lot of question marks there, but it's not one of those things where it's untenable that they'll be good, but a lot of things have to fall in place.
Who do you think plays the majority of games for the 2020 Vikings at left tackle, Eric Eager?
I still think it's Riley Reif. I think Riley Reif is a player who is a veteran in this league that they're paying money to. He's average, and one thing that I found in my research is that left tackles who and Vikings fans should know this, I think, very acutely. The value in going from the worst left tackle in the NFL to an average left tackle is so much more immense than going from an average left tackle to Tyron Smith or some elite level play, because a left tackle can hurt you a lot more than they can help you. And if Riley Reif is average, then a lot of the table is set for Kirk Cousins, and he's the one at that point that determines the pressure rate, good or bad. And he was better a season ago. He took pressure on 39% of his snaps in the first year in Minnesota. It was about 36%, last season. And if he can continue that trend, I think Riley Reif will be fine, and there won't be a whole lot of impetus to put in Azra Cleveland until he's ready.
Are we 100% is Azra Cleveland a left tackle going forward, or is it possible that he is in 4 years from now that he's a guard?
Yeah, I think that there's certainly a question mark there, just because of the level of competition playing in the Mountain West, as opposed to some of the guys that were drafted ahead of him playing in the SEC, the ACC, the Big Ten, and the Big 12, and so forth. So there is a question. He certainly could move inside and play, play guard. Another thing which I think the Vikings are relatively woken up on is, Brian O'Neill's a right tackle, and he's very good at it, and there's a lot of value there. The differential in value between left tackle and right tackle isn't as big as the difference in pay. So having him be very solid at right tackle is going to be immensely valuable. And if he gets a second contract, it's not going to be nearly as big as if he were to move to left tackle. So from that perspective, Cleveland, if he's going to have to play tackle, might have to play left tackle, which isn't necessarily the easiest thing to do for a guy drafted out of a group of 5 school.
Give me a projection for the development that you think Bradbury is going to make, because he obviously had a rough first year, but stepping in as a draft pick and playing on the line can be tough, especially a position like center where there's so much strategy involved and you've got to make line calls and things like that. What do you think the realistic projection is for Garrett Bradbury in 2020 as opposed to 2019?
Well, he's certainly going to improve, and my colleague Timo Risky, did a little bit of research on sort of, curves and sort of like how a guy progresses, and it is offensive linemen, as you would expect. They come in, and a lot like Bradbury, they might have all the athleticism in the world, but they don't have the strength to handle, some of the truly elite players, and that's really where I see, Bradbury. The difficulty with him is that this schedule is chock full of really good players on the interior. You have Green Bay has Kenny Clark, and they play him twice.
Yep. Colts
in week 2, they have DeForest Buckner, and he's a terrific player. They have the Falcons and Grady Jarrett. The Lions have some players. Mike Daniels, for example. Obviously, the Bears have Akeem Hicks, and he's given the Vikings trouble for years. And then Ndamukong Suh with Tampa Bay. I mean, they have a murderer's row. Cameron Jordan for the Saints. Like, it's just a really tough. It's always been a really tough schedule, and that's why you've seen guys like Alfline have struggles. That's why you see Josh Klein, after one season of being okay, they were willing to expend on him because sometimes, it doesn't. These defensive tackles in the NFL right now are so good that oftentimes the differential in ability, if it's not a guy like Marshall Yanda, it's really not going to matter. And the impetus is on Kirk and the offense to get rid of the ball more quickly or to give him space via things like bootlegs and that like.
Eric, let me ask you this, because I've been sort of railing on the Vikings for a long time for not spending draft capital on offensive linemen in the first and second rounds. And they've done that more often recently. Matt Khalil and Garrett Bradbury and Pat Elflein was in the first 3 rounds. What should a team's offensive line draft strategy be in general, in your mind? When should you be looking to take tackles versus centers versus guards?
Yeah, that's a great. I think it very much depends upon the quarterback you have. My boss, Chris Collinsworth, he made a great statement on a Sunday Night Football game about Tom Brady. He said, the reason all these left tackles, Nate Soldier, Trent Brown, the reason why they can be low pedigree players and then go get massive deals in their subsequent teams is that Tom Brady protects his offensive line, not the other way around. Drew Brees protects his offensive line, not the other way around. Kirk Cousins, the guy that plays quarterback for the Vikings, I think it's a little bit more a 50-50 proposition. And so if you have a quarterback like that, the tricky thing is he's being paid so much, but that really does drive the notion that, okay, the difference between a market level deal at left tackle and even the first overall pick at left tackle is substantial, that if you have a quarterback like Kirk Cousins, you should really, everything else being equal, be diving into the offensive line market in the draft more so than free agency, because you need to be able, it's not just the quarterback's contract, it's the quarterback, O-line, wide receiver, tight end contract that all need to come together and add value. And if you have a quarterback who's paid a lot and doesn't protect his offensive line, then the way to try to get by that is to draft a lot of players high on the O-line and hope and pray that 5 of them work out. There's value differential there. I don't think interior offensive line are nearly as important as tackles. And the Vikings did really well with Brian O'Neill there in 18. But I would be drafting tackles pretty high just because you need to, given how valuable they are in the open market and given the type of quarterback that Kirk Cousins is.
I love the way you framed the beginning of that answer in that, because I've said this for years and years, is that we always think it's the offensive line's job to protect the quarterback, and if the offensive line doesn't do 100% of the brick wall protection, then the quarterback is the one that's screwed. And then you look at a guy, Peyton Manning's one of the great signal callers of all time, but by the time, Peyton Manning wasn't mobile when he entered the league, and by the time he got into his mid-30s and later, he was less mobile than a palm tree, for God's sakes, right? And there's seasons in which, there was a year with the Colts, one of his last couple of years with the Colts, in a full season, Peyton Manning was sacked 10 times. Is that because Peyton Manning is flushing out with his legs like Russell Wilson and avoiding pass rushers? No, it's because he understands how to get rid of the ball, how to abort mission on a play, how to throw a pass for an incomplete pass that's not grounding, right? He's getting sacked 10 times versus somebody else getting sacked 35 times because he knows what he's doing. And those offensive line look better because of it too.
In the 1980s, I believe Dan Marino had a stretch of games where he sacked 0 times in 19 games. And he had a season where he sacked 6 times the entire year. And, to me, you look at that example and you're thinking to yourself, okay, this is a guy that has complete command over the offense. He's a guy that, he not only understands where the routes are going, but he understands what the protections are doing. The really tricky part, though, is in my research, the wide receivers are more valuable than the offensive line, because if you got guys that can win in under 2.5 seconds, then the linemen become less important because the quarterback can get rid of the football. If you have receivers that can't win early in the route, then the knockdown chain goes to the offensive line, and if they can't protect for 3 seconds, which many of them can, especially given the athleticism differential, it's tough. So one of I'm hinging this sort of answer on the Vikings in 2020 on, okay, is Justin Jefferson good enough to play at the NFL level? Is Adam Thielen able to, reclaim some of the magic he had without Stephon Diggs, that he had in 2018 with Stephon Diggs, because he was the most valuable player, non-quarterback, in the Vikings, decade in 2018. Kenny Oladipo Johnson, Ken Irv Smith, can they get open? Because to depend upon Kirk to own the offense the way that some of these truly elite quarterbacks own the offense is, I think, a bridge too far.
How tough has this become too, as far as 20 years back, right? Your pressure on the defensive line came from the right end. The left end was more of a base end, and I love them and God bless them, but fat men played in the middle of the D line. And as you just went through, now in the interior, it's athletes. Danielle Hunter plays left end, unheard of 20 years back. The point being is, how much do teams need to start to change their thinking if they have not done this, Eric, when it comes to construction of the O-line, and not just left tackle, but interior? I mean, guards for the most part used to be, hey, this guy can play. He's sort of fat too, right? But this whole dynamic is changing now because of the athletes that are on defensive lines. So do you see teams changing their thought processes? And I guess just as importantly, do you see young players saying, you know what, if I play right guard now, I can actually make a lot because teams are going to need good players at left guard, right guard. It's not just I'm going to make mine if I'm a left tackle in 2020.
Yeah, it's really like one of the interesting quirks about the offensive line market is that the franchise tag is the same amount of money for every position. So it's guard, center, tackle, even though, our research suggests that guards are less valuable, especially left guards, just about the way that most offenses are right-handed, all that kind of thing. So when you're looking at constructing an O-line, oftentimes you're looking for values on the interior, and you're looking for, superstars at tackle, but sometimes you overpay for that, and you're more likely to. It's really tricky because, as you said, the most valuable positions in football are offensive, but it's in a weird way to say offensive. Defensive linemen, I can take Hunter and I can put him on the interior like the Vikings did against New Orleans in the playoffs. I can take Everson Griffin and move him from right end to left end. And the offensive line, you're not, unless you're one of these like MAC schools, you're not rotating linemen positions every single play. And so what's really hard is that, the offensive line is very much a weak link system. You need 5 solid players because the defense can attack your weaknesses. And so it's really tricky because you do need to be able to find value at all 5 of those positions. And if you overpay for, let's say a left tackle who only ends up being average, like Riley Reif, then that money comes, knocks down off of what you can do at right guard or center, and it's a tough one. And I think, as you said, Judd, the evolution of defenses, like your right tackle isn't facing Kenny Mixon 70 times a game, where he's just trying to set the edge against the run.
Yep.
He's facing Danielle Hunter, who's a much better athlete than him. And so that's why, as much flack as we can give the Vikings for being poor at drafting offensive line, that's why Brian O'Neill was a great pick, an athlete out there that can make, that can make teams pay if they try to, if they only isolate the Vikings right side of the offensive line because of how good he can move his feet and how, efficient he is as a pass blocker.
Football.
That's our friend Eric Eager from Pro Football Focus, and it concludes today's deep dive into the Vikings offensive line. And we'll talk again sometime soon, Eric. We appreciate you hanging out with us on Purple Daily today.
Thanks, Eric.
Thanks for having me. Stay safe, guys.
You too.
All right, that's a wrap on this episode of Purple Daily. You can find us in podcast form, Apple, Spotify, ScoreNorth.com, and also on YouTube at youtube.com/ScoreNorth, where we appreciate you clicking the subscribe button down below if that's where you're watching and commenting. We'll see you next time.